To everybody reading this, viewer discretion is advised. Flashing lights, jump scares, and mature content is ahead. Please enjoy this amalgamation of sinister and chilling stories, all given from viewers like you. Thank you.
When I was 6 years old, we lived in the center of the set of 3 very similar houses. I remember ours was purple. The one to the left was blue, and the one to the right was yellow. I recently had bought one of those big, inflatable, bouncy balls from Walmart and had no one to play with me, so I played with it in the backyard by myself. After school one day, I accidentally hit the ball to the yellow house side of the fence. I was going to ask my mom what to do, but a kid on the other side hit it back over for me. Thinking we could play, I hit it back over and he returned it. It became a daily thing, and I would just hit the ball back and forth with him until I got bored after school. The kid wouldn't respond to any questions I had, so I assumed he was just shy. At one point, I hit it over, and he didn't return it, so I asked my mom if I could climb the fence and go get it. She was never outside with me, so she always thought I was playing alone, I guess. We only got the house because my mom was friends with the landlord, and the houses were recently built. She told me that no one had ever lived there. They were still trying to sell it. We moved not long after, but I still have no idea who was returning that ball to me.
My mom is Native American. She named my sister Chula, which means fox. Most likely because of her namesake, but maybe not. My sister loved everything that had to do with a fox. Last November, my mom was doing dishes at the sink and looking out the window at the woods like she always does. Well, she looks up from the dishes to the edge of the woods, and at that moment, a fox steps out of the woods. It sits on its hind legs and stares right at my mom's face, while she stares back through the window. She said it seemed like 5 minutes they stared at each other. Suddenly, the fox got up, turned around, and slowly walked into the woods. My mom said her first thought was to call Chula, tell her about the fox. My sister never answered. She died in a head-on collision that day due to some asshole drunk driver. My mom keeps looking for the fox. It has never come back. I used to work at Phillips, up near Sleepy Hollow in New York. At my lunch breaks, I like to wander through the forest on the work property. One beautiful October day, I was admiring the autumn leaves when I saw a buck standing in front of me. There's a word, numinous, for feeling in the presence of something spiritual, something unworldly. That's how I felt. I quietly and carefully stepped closer to get a better view. I was able to approach quite close, almost close enough to touch him. At that moment, though, the deer turned, and I felt all the hair on my arms rise. The deer's eyes were red and dripping with blood. It must have had some disease that had blinded it, and its blindness allowed me to get so close. In the moment, though, it was terrifying and uncanny. I have been waiting a long time to tell this story. My parents were night cleaners for the Keg restaurant in Toronto. As sometimes they needed extra help, they brought along my uncle, who would normally have just babysat me. I was 10 years old. He also brought over his girlfriend, who I would mainly just hang out with while the rest of them went to work. One night, my uncle's GF and I were playing cards on one of the booths and fell asleep. Well, we were woken up, my uncle screaming, telling us we have to go to the basement and hurry to follow him. We both wake up and start following him, but I seems to be very far ahead. When I turn the corner, I bump into my uncle and ask where the basement and what's the emergency. He responded with telling me was following my mother and father, who yelled at him from the across the room to get to the basement. Standing there puzzled, we catch up to my uncle's GF, who had bumped into my parents. They said that they heard mine and my uncle's GF voice from the basement, and my father had gone to get the spare keys because it was locked. It seemed like something was trying to lure us into the basement. I've told this one before, but here we go. When I was younger, I was told to say a prayer in my head before I go to sleep. It was just a thing I did, which I don't do anymore. I would have been 13 or 14 around the time when the Pope died. Though I didn't know his name, I just knew that some pope had died that day, and that I should probably make a prayer for him. I remember being really tired and lying in my bed, thinking, please bless my family and my friends, yada yada, and please take care of the Pope. I paused at that moment, realizing I didn't know his name. When I heard the words clear as day, Pope John Paul, I sat up immediately and looked around the room, so frightened. It was an old man's voice. Next morning, when I woke up, I went downstairs and saw the newspaper on the table with the big headline, R.I.P. Pope John Paul. Absolutely freaked out and told my parents. Thinking back, I don't really believe in the supernatural. I think everything can be explained. But this, I really don't know what happened. My 2 sons were born when their great-grandmother was alive, but unfortunately she never got to meet either one. My husband's grandma went in for surgery and ending up contracting a raging infection from the hospital that killed her 6 weeks after they were born. She was a great lady, married 60+ years to a sweet man who was the love of her life. He passed 4 years prior, loved my husband to pieces, and was very invested in my pregnancy. I was very sad that my boys never got to meet their Gigi. Fast forward a year or so, my sons are 20 months old and just starting to talk. We're driving down a road and out of nowhere one son starts babbling, "Bobby, Dee Dee, Bobby, Dee Dee." We asked him who they were, but of course get no reply. We start joking about him being haunted. This goes on every so often. Little man starts talking about Bobby and Dee Dee. Then we to my mother-in-law's house. Little man toddles up to her fridge and peers at a picture of her parents she has hanging there. "Bobby, Dee Dee, I have really terrible nightmares a lot. One reoccurring nightmare is about a shadowy figure standing near my bed. It thankfully hasn't happened in a while, but it always starts out the same. In the dream, I wake up from my sleep and see this shadowy blur in one corner of my room. I then actually wake up in a little bit of a panic, but eventually fall asleep. In the dream, I wake up again, I'm laying in my bed, and the shadowy thing is now closer and has formed into the shape of a human. I can never really make out any features, but eventually it's at the foot of my bed, just standing there watching me. There's something so menacing about this thing that every time I've had this dream, I've woken up shaking and screaming while struggling to turn my lights on in a confused state. In the dream, I know this thing shouldn't be there and is going to hurt me, but I can never do to stop it. I recently got a puppy, and now when I have nightmares, he moves from his normal spot near my feet and lays next to me while resting his head on my arm and licking my face. It's helped me a lot. I know that this is probably not the type of story you were looking for, but just talking about that nightmare makes me really uneasy.
When I was young, I went to see my grandpa, who happened to be caretaking for a multimillionaire's ranch, while the prior caretaker was having rotator cuff surgery. One day, he takes me into the prior caretaker's house, and a few others, and has me flip the breakers off. All of them. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I figured it was maintenance of some type. That night at about 11:30, I was sitting on the couch watching the news, and he calls me out onto the porch. He points at the caretaker's house, where we turn the breakers off, BTWOs. But there are 3 lights on. I grab binoculars and look through the windows. No people, no movement, nothing. He looks over at me and says, "That's the 3rd time this week. The first time I went over with my 357 expecting someone to have broken in. But when I got to the house, the door was locked just like I'd left it. I went inside and nothing was out of order except a bar stool was pulled out. Sure enough, we went over and nothing was out of order except the bar stool. So I go downstairs to check the breaker box, and the second I open the breaker box, the lights go off upstairs. I quickly wisened up and got the fuck out of there. Had a lucid dream where I was on a mountain road with forest on either side of me. There was a fire tornado whipping through the trees on one side. The road was dark and empty except for me and my friend Joe. and it was windy and lie by the fire. Then a small gray figure that kind of resembled Gizmo from the Flintstones, classic little green Martian man with a big helmet, was floating in front of me. We just stared at each other from what I remember, but it was very eerie the way he was looking at me, and I remember the detail of his skin texture even. We were in a sort of clear, calm bubble while the fire raged around us. I woke up having forgotten all about it, poured some Captain Crunch berries, and turned on the news. The first thing that came on was a report on a raging fire that started overnight in the Shastas. I was living in the mountains south of the Bay Area. In a flash, the dream instantly came back to me. I paused mid-crunch and was just completely weirded out. Happened last night, actually. I have 2 parakeets, and at night I keep their cage covered to keep them warm and block the light out so they can sleep better. They're usually quiet and sleep peacefully through the night, except for last night. It was around midnight, and all of a sudden they started freaking out and flying around the cage, obviously spooked by something. I quickly uncovered the cage so they could see, and they eventually calmed down and settled on their perch again. It reminded me of all those ghost movies I've seen where animals can see, sense demons and shit that humans can't. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for this, like maybe one of them moved in their sleep and startled the other one, but I don't know. It was definitely unsettling because they never usually do this. Happened last night, actually. I have 2 parakeets, and at night I keep their cage covered to keep them warm and block the light out so they can sleep better. They're usually quiet and sleep peacefully through the night, except for last night. It was around midnight, and all of a sudden they started freaking out and flying around the cage, obviously spooked by something. I quickly uncovered the cage so they could see, and they eventually calmed down and settled on their perch again. It reminded me of all those ghost movies I've seen where animals can see, sense demons and shit that humans can't. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for this, like maybe one of them moved in their sleep and startled the other one, but I don't know. It was definitely unsettling because they never usually do this. I was stuck in a bathroom in a creepy house my family was staying at. I was home alone. You had to force the door into the jamb to get it to close and latch, only to find out that the knob didn't work the latch. I heard the side door slam shut downstairs. I thought my dad was home. I called to him, "Dad, Dad, I'm stuck in the bathroom." I heard him walking on the hardwood, through the kitchen, down the hall, stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Dad, I'm locked in," I yelled. I immediately heard him run up the stairs and stop at the top. Once more, I exclaimed, "I'm locked in the bathroom." 4 more steps to the other side of the door. "Dad! Boom!" The door swung open and slammed into the wall. I stepped into the hall. I looked around. Nobody was there. Nobody at all. I politely said thank you and went straight to bed. When I was 2 years old, my uncle committed a double murder and suicide. He was a meth head and had been taking money from my grandmother, and finally one day she told him no more. That just happened to be the day I was at their house. He went to his room and brought out a shotgun. He shot my grandfather in his face. My grandmother ran and grabbed me. He shot her in the back. She dropped me and rolled over. He pulled out a big knife and hit her in the neck with it. He then turned his attention to me. I remember this vividly. I was crying and he picked me up, rocked me for a minute and sat me in my swing. He pointed the shotgun right at my face. Then all of a sudden he just stopped. Like something was fighting with him. Like physically prevented him from blowing me into a million parts. Next thing I know, the gun is in his mouth and bang. That is all I remember. My parents never told me a single thing about it, and up until a year ago they didn't know I knew about it. When I told my dad, he starts crying and tells me how I was just swinging in my swinger like someone was pushing me. I had forgotten about it until I was like 13, and all of a sudden I remembered. It fucked with my head for a while. About a month ago, I was flying down to Texas to visit a close friend, and it was about 8:30, so it was dusk. The sun was shining inside the plane, so most everyone had the sliding blinds down. Anyway, out of nowhere, I had the urge to look out the window, so go ahead and do so. Immediately, I looked down to see the view, and out of nowhere, probably 400 to 500 feet below the plane, a small jet missile-looking object flies by extremely fast. It was man-made because it had decals and was jet black, but it lacked wings and barely looked large enough to hold a single person. It flew in the opposite direction of the plane, and I saw the jet stream it left behind longer than I saw the actual object. I remember saying, "Whoa," and looking around to see if anyone saw the same thing I did, to no avail. Still have no idea what I saw. It's not exactly creepy, but extremely strange, and a little unsettling. Me and my friends were driving home from a show we all went to. This was about 7 years ago or so, in the Cerritos area. There's an elementary school there, I think, on 186th. I forgot what it's called. Anyway, we drove by a local elementary school, all of us joking and laughing, or whatever 16-year-olds do, and my friend's girlfriend looked over at the playground in the school, screamed, and refused to talk to anyone for a few hours. We all asked her what was wrong, what she saw, what happened, but nothing would make her tell us. We all thought she saw someone on the playground or a dead body or something. All we knew was that she was seriously spooked. As backstory, I should add that she's sensitive to paranormal happenings. I should also add that I don't really believe in ghosts or the like, but whatever. She would have doors fly open at her old house, clothes hangers fly off the rail, cups fall over and then right themselves multiple times. Just crazy shit. Anyway, she eventually told her boyfriend what she had seen. She said that she had briefly seen a bunch of blood-covered people walking around the playground aimlessly. I immediately started blaming exhaustion, as it was around 2 a.m. when we drove by. We looked it up later, and it turns out that a plane had crashed into the school in the late 80s, and a lot of people had died. Spooky music. I was visiting family for winter break in Los Angeles. This was about 5 years ago. I was heading to the bathroom on the second floor of my aunt's house when I saw my cousin, April, on the stairs. April was 4 and very animated. She was busy making funny faces while sitting on the stairs. I asked her what she was doing. She said, "I'm copying the lady with the braid." I looked around. There was no one else but us. I asked, "Where is the lady, April?" She pointed to a beam running parallel to the stairwell. I asked April, "What is the lady doing?" She said, "Making funny faces." I smiled and started walking up the stairs again when April said something that stopped me in my tracks. "April, her braids is around her neck." I turned back and asked April to repeat herself. April pointed, "The lady is hanging by her braid. She's making funny faces." Then April started making a face which I then realized was it someone gasping for air. Creepy as balls.
My dad used to work in a juvenile detention center in the Miami area in the early 70s. He said there was one inmate that reminded him a lot of a young Hannibal Lecter. He wasn't strong, but he was smart and very persuasive. One day he started a riot in his block of cells, just by talking the other inmates into it. My dad and another guard were sent in to check it out and try to calm things down. Everybody in the block was going crazy, banging on the bars, howling and yelling at each other. Everybody except young Hannibal Lecter. He was standing still in the middle of his cell with his arms folded, smiling and muttering the same phrase over and over, quietly. My dad tried to focus on what he was saying, and after a couple seconds, he understood. The inmate was reciting my dad's home phone number. Edit. I don't know how he got it. Maybe he bribed another guard into getting it for him, or he saw it written on some form on his way between rooms or something. The guy never called my dad. In fact, he never really got any strange phone calls ever. But the level of determination this inmate must have had, all just to freak my dad out, was simply impressive. I was at a friend's house around 12 years ago. We were in the basement watching TV when his mom's boyfriend comes down the stairs and tells us to keep it down. We looked at each other, confused, because we were literally just watching TV, and it wasn't on high volume at all. We said we weren't being loud, and he said, "You aren't yelling," and we shook our heads. He just sort of does the, look. and tells us he and my friend's mom had heard someone screaming coming up from the furnace vents, so he thought it was coming from the basement where the furnace is. We didn't hear anything, and we're like 15 feet away from the furnace. Sadly, I can't verify the next story because I wasn't there, but my friend, from the basement, and another friend say they were upstairs in the kitchen one night, hanging out, and they heard a scream, clear as day, coming out of one of the furnace vents. Freaked them out, naturally, but I never did get to hear it. Probably just metal creaking, but it was weird that we were so close to it and didn't hear anything that could be interpreted as a scream. My wife's mother passed away in 2003 from cancer. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at her house for a final celebration of her life. The gathering went late into the evening. My son, 3 at the time, needed to go to bed at that point. I walked with him up the stairs to where he would sleep. The room that my mother-in-law passed away in was upstairs and straight down the hallway as you reach the top of the landing. My son and I walked upstairs together with me holding his hand. As we nearly reached the top of the stairs, my son stopped and wouldn't move, at the point which he could just see down the hallway. He was staring straight down the hall. I looked at him, then down the hall to an open doorway to a completely dark bedroom. He just stared and would not move any further. I asked him, "Buddy, are you okay?" His response was, "Daddy." The light. The light scares me. I looked again down the hallway where he was staring into darkness. "Buddy, you see a light?" "Yes, Daddy." "It scares me." I promptly picked him up and went back downstairs. To this day, the hairs still stand on the back of my neck when I think of it. I am about 98% certain I pissed on a dead guy at Seattle's Gasworks Park on a dark New Year's night at the turn of the millennium, 1999 to 2000. My friend and I were going to go see the fireworks at the Space Needle, but because terrorists had been caught sneaking tons of bombs across the Canada-American border earlier, a pre-9/11's plot to blow up LAX airport, I think, the authorities wouldn't let crowds near the Space Needle. So we went across Lake Union to watch from Gasworks Park. When the fireworks were over, it was dark as fuck, and I had to piss like a racehorse. We stumbled into some bushes, and I opened the fly and let loose. As I was done, I started to walk away, and my foot hit something soft, like a leg, and I freaked the fuck out and ran. My buddy chased after me, asking me what's up, and I told him that I think I accidentally pissed on a sleeping bum, which made him laugh, and I definitely didn't want to go back to apologize, for fear of getting the shit kicked out of me. The next morning on the news, we read that a body had been found at Gasworks. I don't totally remember, but I think it was a murder of a homeless dude. The newspaper didn't mention whether he was covered in piss or not. About a couple weeks after I was born, my dad's best friend Jim died. They were really close, and one of the last things he wanted was to hold little me before he passed. His wish was filled, and some short time after that, he was gone. Fast forward 7 years. I'm now a happy 7-year-old, with a 5-year-old brother and recently born sister. One day the phone rings, and with my mom out and dad in the washroom, I thought it was going to be ignored, as we kids were still too young to answer the phone. No call display, we didn't know if there would be a stranger. But my brother broke the rules and answered, "Hello?" At this point, my dad is out of the washroom and is asking my brother to hand him the phone. He ignores him and keeps listening to whoever is speaking. Before my dad could ask a second time, my brother hangs up, looks at him and says, "Jim says hi and he misses Skywing Nova," then goes back to playing. The look of shock my dad had is what I remember most about this. When I was growing up, one of my best friends told me about a very creepy situation involving him, his younger brother, and a man in the window. When my friend and his little brother were younger, they shared a bedroom. They're some years apart, but his younger brother was born with a multitude of different health issues, including multiple sclerosis, and he's confined to a wheelchair and cannot care for himself. So, to keep an eye on him overnight when his parents couldn't, they shared a bedroom. One night, my friend randomly woke up for no in particular reason and happened to glance over at his younger brother, but noticed something very startling. A strange silhouette of a man wearing a top hat looking in through the window behind his younger brother's crib. The first thing my friend did was jump up and turn the light on, then ran into his parents' room to tell them what he saw. When his parents came back into their room to investigate, his younger brother was having a seizure in his crib. A few of his family members say it was his younger brother's guardian angel standing in the window that night. My friend believes it was death. It's all still pretty unsettling to me. I work at the Myrtles plantation, and I have so many of these stories and events that visitors tell me. The creepiest is one, in my opinion, is that you can sleep at the plantation kind of like a bed and breakfast. Well, we have a room that is filled with those creepy ceramic dolls. There is one doll, though, that was one of the children's favorite and always was in the bed with her at night. The child later died, too long to explain, and the doll stayed on the bed with her. When we started to house guests at the Myrtles, we kept the doll on the bed in memory of the child. The first night when someone slept in the room, they moved the doll to get more comfortable. In the morning, the doll was back in the bed with its hands on the guest's throat. She came out outraged, accusing us that we did something in her room. No one went in or out of her room that night at all. The next guest moved the doll as well, and when he was sleeping, he heard tapping on the wood floors. He woke up and noticed the doll on the floor where the sound was coming from. Everyone who stays in the room and moves the doll will come and go back in its bed. I work at the Myrtles plantation, and I have so many of these stories and events that visitors tell me. The creepiest is one, in my opinion, is that you can sleep at the plantation kind of like a bed and breakfast. Well, we have a room that is filled with those creepy ceramic dolls. There is one doll, though, that was one of the children's favorite and always was in the bed with her at night. The child later died, too long to explain, and the doll stayed on the bed with her. When we started to house guests at the Myrtles, we kept the doll on the bed in memory of the child. The first night when someone slept in the room, they moved the doll to get more comfortable. In the morning, the doll was back in the bed with its hands on the guest's throat. She came out outraged, accusing us that we did something in her room. No one went in or out of her room that night at all. The next guest moved the doll as well, and when he was sleeping, he heard tapping on the wood floors. He woke up and noticed the doll on the floor where the sound was coming from. Everyone who stays in the room and moves the doll will come and go back in its bed.
A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were sleeping together when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake, and I asked what she was talking about. She then woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream or semi-awake hallucination, we thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed with the sheets wrapped up and twisted to their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I had been dreaming the exact same thing that she did and said the exact same thing. I know it's the power of suggestion or whatever, but fuck that. My grandfather died last year, sometime when my son was maybe a year old. We had dinner with the whole family every Friday night, so my son had seen him several times. My grandfather was a very quiet, proud man, but when he thought he was alone or unseen, he would make silly faces at my son to get a laugh. A couple nights after his funeral, my son, who liked to crawl into bed with us in the middle of the night, started just laughing uncontrollably at like 2 a.m. So I get out of bed to see what's going on and find my son sitting in the middle of the living room, in the dark, laughing. I say, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" In toddler speak, he says, "Papa funny." I got a little nervous for some reason and went to pick him up and bring him to our room for the rest of the night. And as I'm hauling him away, he says, "Bye, Papa," and blows a kiss at absolutely nothing I can see. None from me, but I remember a story a high school teacher told me that always stuck with me. My former teacher was home alone when she was a child, at some point in the 70s probably. A man knocked on her door and she opened her main door but kept her screen door locked. He said he was from the gas company and wanted to talk to her parents. She told him they weren't home, and he, without missing a beat, tried to start forcing his way into the home. When he found the screen door to be locked, he pulled out a fucking box cutter and started to cut through the screen. My teacher ran to hide in a clothes hamper in her parents' closet. She said she sat there for about 10 minutes before the police arrived. Thank God a neighbor saw everything and called the police, or she probably would be dead. Also, to put the cherry on the freaking creepy sundae, they found the intruder hiding in the attic. She told us that as a cautionary tale to lock all doors and windows when home alone. Of course, naturally, I would go home from school to be alone for hours. Doom.
A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it was this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after a month of this, and it stopped. Then, after a week or so, it began again. The exact same noise. Exact same time. Finally, one day, he decided to back-dial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about. Still, the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were left. He decided to say, screw it. Ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time, he was terrified every night, unsure why this was happening. He back-dialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time, he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day my mom asks me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He back-dialed the number again and it said the number was disconnected this time, never heard from it again after that. When I was like 14, I was with a friend riding mountain bikes way out in the woods. We decided to turn back and go home for the day. We must have been 2 miles from any houses. Walking up the hill we just rode down from was this old guy with miner clothes from the 1800s carrying a bucket. He was walking up the hill with his back towards us. He was only for a few seconds, and then he disappeared. We were both silent when I said, I thought I saw something. He goes, yeah, me too. He perfectly described the guy. We got out of there very quick. This was in northern Arizona, where they used to gold mine. There was even this old miner's cabin about a mile from us. 25 more. My grandma and her family had a similar shared but not mentioned experience. Grandma fled with the kids from an abusive husband and for a time stayed in a really old, drafty place. It was pretty grim, but they had nowhere else and were at least safe while they looked for a way out into something better. My oldest uncle used to see a middle-aged woman standing in the doorway of the bedroom watching him and his siblings. It would also stand over him at the foot of his bed, just watching. She was dressed in pale, old-fashioned clothes. It really unnerved him. He said it felt menacing, and as though it didn't want him there. But he didn't say anything to anyone because he didn't want to alarm the others, and they had no option but to be there. It wasn't until years later he mentioned the place at a family reunion, and my grandma said she hated the place and couldn't wait to get out, because she was sure she used to see the ghost of a woman in pale clothes watching her. This is my brother's story, but it's a good one. He was working as a night porter at an old hotel from the 18th century in the northern English countryside. One night, a woman came down to reception as white as a sheet with her suitcase, saying she could not sleep and didn't want to stay there. My brother inquired as to why. She said she could hear children laughing all night, and a child had entered her room with a candle and was standing at the foot of the bed and wouldn't leave. My brother mentioned it to his manager the following morning, and he was told that it is a regular occurrence. Before the hotel was a hotel, it used to be used as a school and kindergarten over 100 years ago. Not quite an encounter, but this is a scary story nonetheless, I think. I first got AM when I was about 13. I wasn't very smart about using it, so I was always talking to these random people that I didn't know. One day, some guy who claimed to be from my school and just a couple years older than me, met me and we started talking. Being 13 and Niave, I talked to him for days and developed a crush on him. He asked me if I wanted to meet up to hang out, and we even planned a specific time and place to do so. But I was a little skeptical. I made the smart choice to ask my older sister, who was his age, if she knew this guy. She didn't. which was a red flag to me since the school is small and it's impossible to not know someone there. I decided not to meet the guy and blocked him on AIM because I was creeped out that he obviously had been lying to me. The scariest part? About 3 years later, I saw a news article with that guy's name. He didn't lie about that or the fact that he was from my town, but he was really 25. Why was he in the news? He was convicted of raping 3 young girls who he'd lured from AIM. He planned to murder one of them, but she managed to get away. Reading this thread prompted me to ask my roommate about a weird phenomenon that's been happening to me lately. Sometimes, only when I'm alone, my mattress shakes vigorously. The first time I assumed it was the aggressive laundry dryer in the next room, but it wasn't on when I checked. Laid back down, the shaking resumes. I checked the furnace, the dishwasher, pressed my ear against the wall to listen for our neighbor's dryer. Nothing. Each time I'd lay in bed and the shaking would resume. I noticed the things on my nightstand, including a cup of water, were completely still while my mattress shook. Eventually, I was too tired to give a shit and thought that if I was about to die, I wasn't going to do it this sleepy. A little Googling the next day revealed something similar to old hag. Bed shaking is often felt while lucid dreaming, caught between sleep and consciousness. Funny, I had never felt it before moving into this house and now experience it frequently, even while wide awake and reading or writing in bed, or even sitting on my bed during the day. I kind of wrote it off till just now. The same thing is happening to my roommate. I was about 15 and I was at a friend's house while she and her boyfriend went to pick up food. I was watching TV upstairs when I heard one of her 3 younger sisters talking. She sounded upset and was asking questions, but no one was responding. I figured one of the younger sisters was on the phone. Being that I had thought I was alone and was a bit bashful about being in their house with them when they clearly didn't know I was there, I just turned the volume on the TV up and tried not to eavesdrop. When my friend and her boyfriend returned, I asked which of her sisters was home. She replied that none were there. I insisted I had heard one of her sisters asking questions, sounding upset. It was then that the 2 of them looked at each other and both went white. She looked back at me and asked very slowly, "You heard a young girl talking?" And she sounded upset, asking questions. "Yes," I replied. No idea why she seemed startled. "You are the 3rd person who has been alone in this house and heard a young girl asking questions." Now, for the record, this girl lives in a very suburban neighborhood. Her neighbors are probably 100 to 120 feet away from her house, and they have fences. I honestly am somewhat glad I thought it was her sister, because otherwise I might have lost it.
I have had this happen many, many times in my life, and it still freaks the crap out of me. You'll be asleep, and during the night I will wake up and see all kinds of strange things, like a mass of flies, bees flying all over the bedroom, to people actually being in the room, just stood facing the wall or pacing about. At first I thought they were just messed up dreams, but when I was with my GF on holiday, it happened again, and I saw a man pacing back and forth on the balcony, and then all of a sudden at the end of the bed still pacing up and down. I covered my girlfriend to protect her and just stared at this guy for what felt like ages. Then my girlfriend asks what's wrong, and then I freak out realizing I'm not actually asleep. Really does confuse the hell out of me when I try and make sense of what the hell happened. My best friend was killed just outside his apartment. The next day, a few of us headed over to his place to pick up something for him to wear for his funeral, clean his house a bit, throw out his porn stash, etc. We rounded the corner where he'd been shot, and I, unmistakably, heard a scream. But it seemed to come from inside my head. It's hard to describe, but it was an angry, hurting scream. I was so stunned when it happened that I didn't say a word to anyone else. I guess it's possible they heard it too. I had a badass history teacher who was a lieutenant in Vietnam, and we would spend most of the class trying to get him to tell stories from Vietnam and the 60s. One day a kid asked him if he'd ever been shot, and he told us that he was, and here's how it happened. He was walking through a trail in the jungle on patrol. with a guy in front of him and a guy behind him, and he says he hears the guy behind him go Jerry in order to get his attention. He preferred to be addressed by his rank, so he ignored the guy. He said he heard him say it again, and the third time he heard Jerry, he turned around and snapped, "What?" At that exact moment, a Viet Cong fired and just missed him, hitting the guy in front of him in the throat. The second bullet got him in the calf. He and the rest of his men opened fire and killed the sniper, and somehow the guy that got shot in the throat survived. Later, he asked the guy behind him what he had been trying to get his attention about, and the guy said he hadn't said anything, and if he had, he would have addressed him by his rank. When I was 16, my grandfather passed away from cancer. We every close, and I was absolutely devastated when he died. The funeral was the worst day of my life. After he passed, I would sometimes have dreams about him. We would be doing normal stuff, and he would be chit-chatting with me in Greek. At some point, it would dawn on me that this couldn't be possible, and that he was gone. And I would get extremely upset, knowing I was about to wake up. I would wake up sobbing, usually, from these dreams. Well, about 2 years ago, my uncle and his wife found out she was expecting. The day before she went to find out the sex of the baby, I had another dream about my grandfather. He was in my house, sitting on his couch with me. He started to get up and walk away, but instead of feeling sad, I was totally calm. In English, he explained that even though he was going away, I shouldn't be sad because he was going to see me again very soon. He told me he loved me, and I woke up. When I went to go see my uncle later that day, they announced that the baby was going to be a boy named Andreas, my grandfather's name, and that they wanted me to be his godmother. I know there is probably some psychological reason for this happening, but after hearing other stories from my grandmother and uncle, I believe that my grandfather is still with us somehow, and I believe it every time I look at my godson. Ooh, I can answer this one. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was laying on my couch with a blanket over my head that I pulled tight so that I could watch YouTube videos on my phone. Suddenly, there was a face imprint in the blanket where something pushed its face in really hard, about 6 inches from my own face, and it did this really long, loud sniff. Well, it was more like one long breath taken in through the nose, but the point is that it was really loud and freaky. The face imprint slowly just faded out of the blanket, and I sat in terror for a good 5 minutes before I could muster the courage to come out from under the blanket. I avoid the living room at night at all costs now. When I was a little kid, my grandmother developed dementia. She would talk to herself, talk to my dead grandpa, and talk to a little brown-haired girl. We all assumed that it was simply related to her dementia. After she died, our family sold her house to a friend of the family. This is where things get bizarre. About 4 years later, my dad received a phone call from the current property owner. He said that he wanted to speak with my dad in person, and that it was urgent. The current owner told my dad that he thought the house was haunted. He said that his 2 daughters were having horrible nightmares, hearing voices, and that the youngest daughter had seen a little brown-haired girl in the basement on multiple occasions. My dad told the man about the little girl that my grandmother talked to. Both of them were a little shaken up about it. My dad had known this man his entire life and considered him to be a very honest and logical person. My family doesn't talk about it much. Nobody would believe us anyway. My dad's friend ended up selling the property a few months later. We don't know who owns the house now and haven't heard of anything like that since. I consider myself to be a very rational person, but I have come to realize that there are just some things that you can't explain. My aunt went to Salem and asked my mom, who couldn't go on the trip, if she'd like something from Salem. My mom asked for dirt from a witch's grave. I don't know why. My aunt gets a jar of the dirt and brings it home with her. She lives on the other side of the U.S. and says she'd send to my mom. A week or 2 passes and my aunt calls my mom hysterically crying. When she calmed down, she told my mom she walked into her living room and there was a woman sitting on her couch in a gown, like a plain nightgown. Her hair looked like it was chopped off, like someone cut it without giving a shit. The sitting woman looked at my aunt and said, "Look at my hands," and held up her hands, showing raw skin like she was bound by ropes. My aunt noped to the fuck put of there, grabbed her phone, then left the house and immediately called my mom. She threw out the jar of dirt after that. I have two very honest and reliable friends who claim to have seen Bigfoot just outside of Estacada, Oregon. One of their brothers was there too. All three give the exact same account. I've seen them discuss the encounter for long periods of time, seeming completely honest. They never mentioned Bigfoot before the sighting, and all three went on to get into cryptozoology afterwards. I believe they think they saw Bigfoot. Whether it was actually Bigfoot or not is up for debate. Basically, Bigfoot ran across the road 15 to 20 feet from their car. Once Bigfoot reached the opposite side of the road, the animal leaped into a tree and over an 8-foot-tall fence in 2 motions. They stopped and looked at footprints. They've always been consistent in their story and get a little weird when they talk about it. When I was 10 and had just moved into the house I currently lived in, I had a messed up encounter with a spirit in my basement. My pep told me to move a small box into the basement. I went down into the basement and I thought I heard a whisper, but I didn't really give a fuck. I put the box down in the corner. I turned around and I saw a transparent figure of an older gentleman I've never met. He was wearing overalls. I fainted, and when I woke up, nothing was there. It had been about 5 minutes and my dad was calling me up. I never told anybody about it until my dad had the same encounter about 3 years after that. A couple years back, my father and I had some experiences in our house. We both claimed to have seen a shadow person walking into the same room at around the same time at night, 7 p.m.-ish. I constantly heard the same set of footsteps on the floor above me. I lived in the basement, and you just had a general eerie vibe. I also had an experience with sleep paralysis and awful dreams. Then one day, my grandmother tells me she hears someone talking to her, and my grandma is not suffering from dementia or isn't senile. I shat my bricks and moved out within the year. It doesn't help that I'm afraid of the dark, though. I hate going back to that house. This freaked me out, but might not be actually paranormal. So when I was around 15, I was sleeping by myself since my parents were out on date night. I'm not one to get scared, so I didn't care. It was 11:30 and I was tired, so I figured I'd go to sleep. It was a new moon, and I live in middle of Nowhereville, so there was no light. As I lay there, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I thought maybe my parents had come home. But then they were next to me, slowly approaching where I lay. I looked in the direction but couldn't see because it was dark. I was too scared to do anything. Then it came right next to me and shivers were sent down my spine. I didn't move for 5 minutes as I lay there. It seemed like hours. I heard breathing and felt someone was looking at me. I finally got the courage and whipped out my flashlight. "Hey, I'm Flashlight Man, remember me?" And shined it. There was nothing. However, as I took it out, I heard footsteps running away. When I shined it over there was nothing, but the footsteps continued. This may not have been paranormal because I had had nightmares of people staring at me after the break-in stare, but still, it was scary. One freaky thing that happened to me when I was meditating. I have anxiety sometimes, so I try to meditate and clear my mind to alleviate it. I was trying to focus on my breath, but my mind kept going to an image of my fiancé's deceased grandmother. She passed away well before we started dating, so I'd never met her before. Kind of hesitantly, I say to myself, well, if you are a spirit and need to tell me something, then let me know. My mind was kind of brought, not sure how to describe it, to thoughts of her telling my fiancé's mom how even though she isn't happy in her marriage, she needs to stick with it and get through it. and other personal stuff that I didn't really want to discuss with my future mother-in-law. So whoa, hold up. If you want her to know these things, go to her in a dream or something. Then I kind of just brushed it off as a weird meditation experience and nothing more. I didn't mention it to anyone else. Come to find out, that night, she had a dream with her mother in it, telling her the same basic message I had received. Coincidence or paranormal? I'm not sure, but it creeped me out.
When I lived in NY with my family, my dad bought a Rottweiler puppy. Cutest puppy ever. He lived in the garage. My dad loved his dog so much he never parked his car in the garage. It was specially made for Buddy. He had a twin mattress for him, his own warm rug, play area. My dad made the whole garage into a puppy heaven. Even though Buddy was allowed into the house, the garage was only for him. He had a fancy metal bowl stand, and when he ate, the metal bowls would clink together. And sometimes at night, he scratched at the door, signaling he needs to go out to pee. Well, when our beloved Buddy passed away, we would still hear the metal bowls clinking together and scratching at the door. It was so heartbreaking, because my dad would run to the garage and say, "Come on, Bud, let's go for a walk." And the garage was empty. My story may not be scary, but it is paranormal. My grandfather died when my mother was pregnant with my younger brother. My brother has my granddad's name, and we always jokingly said he had Grandpa's soul. One day, I was about 14 and my brother was 7. My family went on a walk in the forest. We were walking for a while when there was a small path left to us that led to a small field. My brother held my mom's arm and said, Mom, I want to go there. That's where I have fun. That's where the wonderful music plays." My mother had tears in her eyes as she explained to us that in her youth, my grandpa used to play saxophone in a Bavarian music group, and every summer they played at a small festival on that field. My maternal grandma and I had been extremely close, and she died of cancer. It was a very traumatic time for me. One day, a few months later, I get a phone call from my dad who says, "No, do this. I have something to tell you, but it's pretty weird." I asked what's going on, worried something bad had happened. He told me that he had been driving to work that day, and all of a sudden, the radio volume lowered itself. I'm a bit skeptical, thinking, yeah, bad wiring can do that. But then he tells me that the instant that happened, he felt my grandma. He felt her presence sitting next to him in the car, and heard her in his head telling him that everything was okay, and she was happy. He said it was such a strong feeling that he had to pull over and even teared up. My dad is not a person who believes in the supernatural at all. He is also not the type to make something like that up just to comfort me. I fully believe that it happened. As soon as he told me, I started crying, out of sadness and happiness at the same time. We never heard from her again. Time for a non-scary experience. I've seen a few things myself, but I suppose they could be explained away. However, my mum has seen a lot of things, and I trust her not to lie about them. Long story short, my mum miscarried 3 babies before she finally had me. After I was born, she used to see babies sat on top of my dad while he was sleeping. She was convinced that these were the children that she lost. Over the years, weird things have happened that while they aren't scary, they're just odd. She used to come and check on me when I was younger, and she said one night she popped her head in, and I was asleep. I was around 1 at this point. On her way back from the toilet, she checked again, and my blanket was on the floor, folded neatly into a square. No one else was in the house, which was weird. More recently, around the same time every year, she gets woken up and can see a woman around my age stood at the bottom of the bed. She says it's odd because she can see this young woman as clear as day, like she is really in the room. She's not just a shadow or a black form of a human. After the third time this happened in 3 years, I asked if there was any link to the young woman my mom kept seeing and the children she lost. She said the first one would have been due in the month that she keeps seeing this young woman in. Again, it's not scary. My mom takes comfort in seeing her, and I like the fact that maybe there is someone looking over me, making sure I'm okay. When I was in college, I took care of a disabled guy named Anthony. He had the earliest form of muscular dystrophy, Duchenne, among other conditions, Asperger's, OCD, anxiety. Despite the challenges in his life, Anthony was a very lively person with infectious enthusiasm. He passed away doing what he loved, playing Mario Kart on the Wii. Anthony and I would often visit his friend Miyuki, a disabled adult with cerebral palsy. Miyuki doesn't talk much, but she's delightful. Anyway, after Anthony passed away, Miyuki and her parents, whom she lived with, started having mysterious problems with their lights flickering. Miyuki says it's Anthony having fun playing with the lights. Her parents have their electricity checked a few times, but the lights still flicker. All the while, Miyuki periodically has conversations with Anthony and leaves him some space in her bed when she goes to sleep. Friends of ours signed a lease on a house years ago and ended up paying a large fee just to get the hell out of there. They had 4 kids. One was a baby. When they first moved in, the next to oldest boy started acting strange and made random comments like, "There's bodies in the attic," Zrenya, and asked who was in his room the night before. They started seeing shadow people, running from room to room, child-sized. They could feel a sinister presence in the house, but it wasn't the child ghost. The kitchen seemed to be a focal point. Things were always thrown around and moved from place to place. After a while, they were all so scared of this place that the whole family basically set up camp in the living room and slept there. One night, they heard the steps creaking and saw one of the small shadows descend, look through the banister, and they clearly heard, "Can you see me now?" It was after that they talked to the landlord and found out how much they had to pay to get out of the lease. They did it and got out of there. They realized afterwards that the ghosts may have been the reason that such a nice house was so affordable.
I worked at a hotel. I received a phone call from 406. They asked for a wake-up call at 6:30 a.m. I set it for them. I checked to see who was in the room. On the computer, it showed empty. The phone rings again from the same room. A different voice asks for a wake-up call at 6:45 a.m. At this point, I'm like, haha, nice prank, whatever. I changed the time. I sent one of my guest services guy up there. 16-year-old Hispanic kid. He gives me play-by-play updates on the radio. Okay, I'm knocking. All right, I'm entering. Then I heard a muffled sound, then silence. That kid sprinted across the property back to the front desk. He was like, oh shit, the curtains were moving. I sent him back to the room because he dropped his radio. Once again, he gives me play-by-play updates. As soon as he opens the door, my phone rings again. 406 again. A different voice from the previous 2 people, asking for a wake-up call at 6:30 a.m. Heard this from a nurse at a nursing home, so she is working the night shift. It's about 1 a.m. at the home. And a patient, let's call her Mrs. K, comes to the nurse's station to ask for some water. So she tells a co-worker to get Mrs. K some water. They say okay. So about an hour later, Mrs. K is back asking for water again. She tells her to go back to her room and wait for it. She again asks her co-worker to get Mrs. K some water. Mrs. K is back a third time, and the time the nurse gets it herself. She gets the water, goes to the room, and no Mrs. K asks her co-workers where she is. Turns out she died earlier that evening. When I was about 8 or 9, I lived in my grandparents' house. It was huge. The basement was fully outfitted with a kitchen and everything, so that was basically our house. I shared a room with my sisters, which was, of course, at the end of the hall. One night I really had to go, but being young, I was terrified of the dark. Eventually, the pain in my bladder overcame my fear, and I slowly got up and slunk over to the door. As I opened it, I saw something at the far end of the hall where the bathroom was. It looked like a white or light gray silhouette of a man. He was just standing at the end of the hall, not moving. As I watched, he suddenly began running straight at me. He made no sound or noise. I screamed, slammed the door shut, leaped into bed, and promptly wet myself, sobbing. I never saw any sign of him again, but I made damn sure I used the bathroom before I went to bed every night since. Okay, I don't believe in ghosts, and I have never had a hallucination like this before, but I still don't know how to explain this. When I was about 13, my little 3-year-old sister woke up in the middle of the night, screaming like crazy. It was right across the hall from me, so I woke up. When I looked up, standing in my door was a woman. She had straight black hair a little past her shoulders and was wearing a white dress. Her head was moving in a circular motion, like when you're rolling your neck to stretch it. I watched for a few moments as fear set in, then decided to pull the covers over my face. Maybe 30 seconds passed as I panicked with my eyes closed, then decided to check if it was there. Sure enough, the woman was still standing there, rolling her neck. At this point, I said, "Mom, M-O-M, Moom," until I was really yelling as loud as I could. My mom rushed up the stairs, reached her hand in my door, and flipped on the light switch. At that moment, the specter disappeared for a month after I barely went in my room. I slept on my sister's floor with a sleeping bag. I'm in my 30s now and don't know exactly what to make of it. I'm a sane person and don't really believe in the paranormal, but still can't really reconcile that moment. This story is from my mom. She was young when she experienced it. Back then, Indonesia, especially the island of Java, still had dense, spooky forests. She lived in a house near a factory, behind it a wide forest and a graveyard. One night, while she was doing her prayers, we're Muslims, she felt someone behind her slowly creeping out to her side. She remembered clearly that it was a Pokong. The creepy thing is, for a few seconds that felt like hours for her, it stood still and did nothing, not even looking at her. It then evaporated into smoke and entered an empty shelf in a wardrobe. It may not be that scary when put into a text, but FYI, Indonesia has some pretty serious paranormal shit. When I was a kid, I did yard work for this incredibly lovely old couple. They told me that when they moved into their house, they had to empty out a few of the rooms and closets of the previous owner's stuff. After that, they heard bumping sounds like someone wandering around the house in the dark. They called the previous owners to ask if the sounds were a normal thing. "Oh, you emptied out the upstairs closet, didn't you? Just put the cane back in the closet so he can see where he's going. Without it, he just stumbles around, bumping into things and making noise." They put the cane back and the noise stopped. They left it in that closet for over 30 years until they moved out. I was helping them clear the house when I saw this cane. It was a pretty normal wooden cane with a rubber nub on it, but it had these scorch marks on the end like someone used it to poke at a fire. I asked them if this was the cane. They smiled and nodded. Then they gave me the cane.
When I was 11, I had an extremely vivid dream of a man in old jeans, bare-chested, with long gray hair, about my father's age. He was sitting in sunshine on a crate or something, and I was standing near him in a black dress, feeling fat and gross and awkward. I was a fat, ugly preteen and not very popular. He was looking at me lovingly and telling me that I was beautiful and sexy. I felt the most intense love from this guy who, at the time, was about my father's age. When I woke up, I was devastated that it wasn't real, even though at the time I didn't find this person visually attractive in the least. To me, he seemed old. 20 years later, I met my current guy. He's the spitting image of that guy on the crate. Took a picture on my old webcam, and there was a black humanoid-looking figure standing behind me. It absolutely scared the shit out of me. And some other strange occupancies have happened since. I have a black cat, and it was walking into the room, and then I saw it morph into a shadow of a human in one of the bedrooms. I went in, and the cat wasn't in there. The weirdest, which I don't know to this point if it was real or not, is once I went downstairs, and all the cabinets were wide open, and the front door was open also. I was home alone. Edit. I have been digging. I can't assess it on my old email, but I am about to break out the desktop. I originally took the picture that's been sitting in the garage. Will deliver when I'm done.
My mother, who doesn't believe in any sort of hokey nonsense, once told me a story where one night her and a couple of friends were driving home one night after hanging out. No drugs or alcohol involved. They were crossing a bridge when suddenly their car died and then all the street lights cut off. Then they heard a throbbing sound like a large engine idling and saw a flash of lights cross overhead rapidly. A few moments later, all of the lights came back on, and then car started back up immediately. A bit unnerved, they continued home. A few days later, the Pascagoula abduction story was on the news. Apparently, they encountered the same craft that supposedly took those two men. My family sails on the Great Lakes. A local author wrote 2 books called Haunted Lakes, The Fern, and 2. The second book came out when I was 10 or 12. It detailed a spooky story of a cloudy day where a local guide was leading one visitor through an island lighthouse. It was a cloudy, crappy day. The visitor stopped and asked the guide whether he had his kids with him on the island. Guide says no, and as far as he knows, there's no kids on the island. Visitor is puzzled since he can hear distant cries of mutter, mother, and kids playing. Author of book assumes haunted because many of the old keepers were from Germany. But I've always had a strong suspicion those two just heard my brother and I, probably about 4 and 6 at the time. My family tended to go out to islands on our sailboat even when the weather wasn't great, and we would play outside as long as it wasn't pouring rain or storming. We also grew up speaking German, since my mom taught German at a school and we were quite loud. Finally, we had a small craft and knew all the anchorages. If we had been on the island, no one might have seen us. So I think I got written into a book as a ghost.
Before I was born, my father and mother had a small apartment together. My mother told me once she went in the basement and saw a woman standing at the base of the steps, just staring up at her, and then she just vanished. Then my father was in the shower, one with a sliding glass door that you can barely make out what's on the other side, when a large figure walked up to the other side of the glass and banged on it, making it blow out. My mother found him in the fetal position in the shower, covered in glass, and no one was around. That last one made them move out. He confirmed it happened, but doesn't like to talk about it. He's a relatively tough dude, so for something to scare him that much means a lot. Somewhere in between those 2 occurrences, they came home to find absolutely everything moved over about an inch. They realized this caused they're not very good at dusting. My cousin used to live in a house which I am absolutely convinced was haunted. It felt strange in there. I felt uneasy going to the toilet on my own for some reason. The dog was never happy there at all, and there were tons of strange electrical issues, such as the TV turning on its own. I slept there one night and I heard noises the whole time, like someone walking up and down the stairs, door squeaks, TV turning on again. I was actually really scared, and I was 18 at the time and had never believed in ghosts at all. Even my uncle, who is the most no-nonsense guy in the world, said he felt someone's hand on his shoulder. Just walking around felt strange, but it's hard to put into words. They ended up even having a vicar around to cleanse the house, but they ended up moving with a few months, leaving behind a big deposit. It's crazy that a bunch of normally rational people were scared out of a house. I myself never went back after the sleepless night there. This one isn't necessarily scary, but definitely paranormal. I was 14 and sitting by myself in my living room playing some Halo when I noticed that the room around me seemed oddly quiet. I paused the game and tried to listen for the difference. It was strange. My house is over 100 years old, and usually there's an odd creak audible from somewhere nearby. Not now, though. It was dead quiet. I felt strange, but not threatened. There was nothing sinister about the silence. I sat for a few more minutes, just listening. It almost felt peaceful, actually. Then suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder, very lightly and briefly. But even today, I still remember the distinct feeling of a hand on my shoulder. It didn't scare me, nor did I jump up in surprise. I actually felt a familiar presence, like family. I mentioned the experience to my mom, and she told me she'd experienced the same thing, only one room over. She says she felt her father's presence with the hand pretty cool.
One night when I was maybe 10 to 12, I had trouble falling asleep. My bedroom was the entire top floor of our house, with my bed and such being on the left side and storage closets, and a play area being on the right. I was lying in bed when I heard a noise from the other side of the room and see a rocking horse begin to rock. It was sitting just outside one of the storage closet doors. It proceeded to rock its way halfway across the room and stopped dead under the ceiling light. At this point, I was freaking out and just buried my head under blankets and never peeked out again until morning. It was all confirmed to not be a dream, as the rocking horse was still in the middle of my room when I woke up. Furthermore, I got a stern reprimand from my parents for being up out of bed, playing with my toys well past my bedtime. Their bedroom was directly below the storage closet play area and had heard the creaking of the rocking horse shuffling across the room.
When I was 17, I went to my mate's house for some beers for his birthday. I probably only had about 5 drinks. Come the early hours of the morning, probably around 2 a.m., I head out to the kitchen for a drink. I pour a drink of water and turn around and take a sip. And as I'm swallowing, I swear I hear footsteps. The ground in the entire room is all made up of tiles. So I hold my drink down and listen for a few seconds. Next thing I know, I hear fast footsteps in front of me running towards me. And suddenly, a huge cold breeze blew right through me. At that point, I just freaked out and ran back for the bedroom. I ended up waking my friend up and telling him what happened, and we listened and could hear odd bangs and bumps from out there, but nothing out of the ordinary after that ever happened. I'll still always remember it, though. Gives me goosebumps writing this. My dad once told me a story about one of his cousins. The cousin used to live with his family, wife and daughter, in an apartment building. On the floor above them lived an old widowed woman whose young son, around 24 to 25, served in the Indian Army and had died during a bomb attack somewhere in North India. A few weeks after the funeral, my uncle started having dreams about the son who had died. He would tell my dad and his mom that the son keeps knocking on his door in the dream and just stands there once the door is opened. He had the same dream for 2 weeks straight, until one night before dinner, he opened his front door to go down to the lobby and saw the son standing in front of him. He quickly shut the door, freaked out for a few minutes behind the door, and opened it again to find the son still standing there. I'm not sure what happened right after, but my uncle then started seeing the son inside his apartment, and then it just stopped. He didn't see the son anymore. Maybe it actually happened, or it was the psychological aftermath of overthinking about a death. It creeped me out regardless. According to my mother, my sister once went to her afraid of someone in her room, then gave a good physical description of my mother's father, who'd been dead long before either of us were born. My sister had no reason to know what he looked like. Not just because he was long dead, but because he was never in any of our family photos. Because my mother hated him. Because he was a pedophile.
My grandfather told me this story about how one time he was sitting in a chair in front of the house when he heard his wife repeatedly calling him from inside the house. The thing is, my grandmother passed away a few years before that. But he told me that the voice was so pressing that he actually got up to look inside the house, and as soon as he got inside, he heard a loud crash behind him and turned around to see that the chair he has been sitting in moments ago had been crushed by the cast iron gutter that fell on it. If he didn't came inside the house, he would have probably been seriously injured. I don't know if it's paranormal or not, but every time I think about it, it sends chills down my spine.
Random abandoned house near a dam in the middle of nowhere, Japan.
The driveway was overgrown, so if you weren't careful too, you wouldn't even notice a house was there. After entering the main room, it was plainly obvious the only object of interest there was the skull of a deer. It seemed deliberately positioned to be staring at whomever dared to enter the house. Upon further investigation, other deer parts helped me confirm the identity of the animal. Hoofs and other assorted bones spread about the site. There were no other signs of other animals around, although a radio that appeared to once be powered by a couple of car batteries caught my attention. I've no idea what was going on around there, but if people are interested, I'll post pictures. Was exploring a house in a small country town with a friend. His family was thinking about buying it. They were told it was abandoned, and they could have it if they paid the back taxes owed. 2-story house with attic. We go in usual shit. There was a cat litter box that didn't seem too old. Clutter everywhere. We were literally having to move stuff around just to go to other rooms. Newish food in places, we were beginning to wonder if it was really abandoned. We found some old tax documents and stuff for the original owner in a sort of storage room. In the attic, we found where a couple of teens or homeless younger people had hung out in the basement and left stuff and writing on the walls. The creepiest part was the original owner's bedroom. Pictures everywhere, mostly black and white without frames. Old bed mattress, old sheets. A ring missing a diamond or two. An empty prescription pill bottle. And dried blood splattered all over the bed. Downingtown Twin Tunnels. There is a break in the second tunnel where it turns, so you can't see through to the end. This tunnel is not a roadway. Anyway, we went at night, OBV, and it was pitch black sans our flashlights. We had heard rumors that people would hang themselves at the split. But we assume most of what you hear about places like this are solely rumors. We came across a noose at the split in the tunnel hanging in its own creepy way. Clearly, it was placed there to spook people. If someone had used it to actually hang themselves, it wouldn't be there anymore since there was no body. But the stereotypical-looking noose that it was in the place that it was still left us feeling unsettled. There's an old abandoned sugar beet mill a couple towns over from where I live. One night I was on a Tinder date with a dude who lived pretty close nearby. He decided that the best way to spend the date would be to go park right next to the mill that had been notoriously flooded with homeless people, right in the height of the stupid clown epidemic, and tell me about the time his brother and his friends decided to go explore the mill. The place is covered in asbestos, so they all went in with hospital masks and explored a bit. There was nothing too out of the ordinary, just the usual shit and tagging you find in abandoned places. And then they got to the basement. Apparently there were carcasses and pelts everywhere. Organs and jars. Bones all over, you name it. According to the guy, there was somebody incredibly interested in anatomy, and he decided to satiate his curiosity by hacking apart different animals. I don't really know the credibility of the story, but it's scary as shit to hear when you're sitting 30 feet away from the setting at 11 p.m. There was no second date. There is an abandoned hospital near LA called the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital or something. Can't remember exactly. A group of me and 4 others went exploring at night, which turned out to be a lot scarier than my fragile-ass self was ready for. So I, for the most part, stayed outside while my friends searched the inside areas. Inside one of the buildings, my friend found patient info, which was pretty neat. Also, edit to add, do not try visiting this one unless you aren't afraid of cops. We ran from some. Probably won't go back. Oh, God. And just as I was typing this, I remembered a time I went and explored Scary Dairy by the CSUCI campus in Camarillo. In one of the rooms, I found bags that were knotted together and bleeding. One was open and full of beaten guts, like someone had either blended the bag's contents or slammed them on the floor repeatedly. I remember settling on it being small animal guts to reassure myself, but I took a picture with my DSLR to be safe and decided to look later. Never did. I really should check on that, but it has been years. When I worked for an insurance company about a year ago, there was little to do. Unless a computer broke, I was sitting at my desk on Reddit. So I started going on short walks, thinking it looked better if I wasn't at my desk all day. So I started finding my way to the basements of the 4 buildings the company had. One was owned by a bank, but it was still the same building, so I went anyway. We found a break room. In said break room was food and pantries and a coffee pot and usual break room stuff. Dirty dishes in the sink and all that, but the more I looked around, the more it looked like people just got up and left in a hurry. Things weren't cleaned, left out on counters, etc. And this part of the building wasn't used anymore. I remember finding a jar of grape jelly open on the counter with a knife still in it. I checked the expiration date, 2006. I looked in the pantry, same thing. Everything was dated for nearly a decade ago, yet there was still stuff out like someone was on break and stepped out for a phone call. The whole place was really eerie. My best friend from high school and his family owned an orchard in Kashmir, Washington. They had a new double-wide manufactured home put on the property next to an old abandoned house. The story was they bought the orchards, but part of the deal was the old man that had lived there was allowed to remain until he passed in the mid-'80s. His son had drowned there in an open septic tank as a small boy, and the wife had died of a broken heart. When my mom and her husband were on the outs, the family offered to let us stay in the old house and had the electricity turned on. The basement was super creepy. The worst thing for me was that I kept finding a rubber fireman toy doll on a shelf in one of the rooms downstairs. I am sure someone was fucking with me, but it still creeped me out. Fell asleep on the couch in the living room one night, to be awakened by a breathing noise and something touching the side of my face. I almost shit my pants, jumping up screaming and running for the front door. There was a small window near the back of the couch that was broken from a billiard ball years ago, and one of the owner's horses had come up and stuck his nose through it, nuzzling my head. Closest I ever came to a heart attack. Not really creepy, but a friend and I were exploring this abandoned prison just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. We had done this many times before, but this time was a little different. Instead of going straight to the main compound that day, we decided to go to the outer facilities that were in the surrounding woods. Everything went fine and dandy till we started to get into the main compound. We were on the second floor about to round a corner when two 6-foot-tall naked guys round the same corner right in front of us. Both groups were pretty shocked, and we both just turned around and went our separate ways, and I never saw those two again. I had heard people filmed porn there, but I didn't think I would actually see it. In my hometown, there was this old abandoned industrial park. It has since been gentrified into a Soto Sopa-type restaurant area, and these things don't exist anymore. But we got to go exploring a few times before it got shuttered up and refurbished. At any rate, we had been walking through one of the more run-down buildings and found this one room full of half-circular sheets of paper. There were just hundreds of them strewn about and all over the place, snagged on cracks in the concrete wall, tangled in the ivy poking through the ceiling, tucked beside the shattered window panes and everywhere else. The paper had a radial dial shape on it, and at the top it read, Spirit-O-Meter. A few of them had readings tracking around the center of the dial. It looked as though someone had been ghost hunting for spirits, found something of note, and had promptly fled the premises. Kind of spooky. Of course, that didn't deter us from looking through the rest of the really cool post-apocalyptic looking building. It was only after we left and looked up the address that we realized the building had been a bourbon distillery. The spirits being recorded were liquor spirits. Gave us all a smile when we found out the truth. Creepy abandoned house property garage that's been around for years. Me and my friends smelled weed, so we all went into the property to see if we could find it. The house was extremely run down, eerie but gorgeous at the same time. A lot of odd stuff got left behind. Like a gorgeous, expensive classic car still sits on the garage. Rotting away, of course. It's gorgeous. There's also an old tractor and other once expensive things in there. There were cars on the side yard, a house full of business papers, mail, old furniture, etc. It's just weird. We found a few abandoned old cars, wrappers and shit, a creepy-ass Elmo doll, hundreds and hundreds of business papers and other things listed to the residents, dated earlier 1900s, clothes, and a picture. Creepy part was this black and white Polaroid-looking picture had an older teen girl in it, sitting on the same, now completely destroyed, car in the overgrown yard. The exact same clothes in the picture were laying in the house, the only clothes too, and it was posed in the side yard where the car was still sat. Oh yeah, and her face was perfectly faded away. My stupid fucking friend brought it home and it terrified me, so I took it back. Went back months later and haven't seen it since. The place is eerie. There's so many more little details, but that's the basics. A friend and I were exploring our local abandoned TB hospital, later turned asylum, and came across a little girl. Keep in mind, this place was miles from any houses or civilization. Nearest thing was a quarry a few miles away. We had been leaving the administration building and headed across the parking lot to the main hospital when we noticed a little girl standing by the secondary entrance several yards to the right of the main door. She was about 7 or 8, long brown hair and wearing a red sequins dress with white tights and matching shoes. My friend made a point to face forward and ignore her existence, but I was concerned about the situation and kept an eye on her. As we drew close to the main entrance, she said in a sing-songy voice, "I wouldn't go in there if I were you. There's ghosts." I vaguely remember cracking a Ghostbusters joke and walking the fuck out of there straight into the building. Checked out of the first window we came to and she was gone. Didn't encounter another soul for the rest of the trip. I like to imagine she had some prankster parents hiding nearby having a good laugh, but I doubt it. As a kid, my friend and I would explore, well, trespass, around the neighborhood. We'd jump fences between yards, scale sheds and trees, break into abandoned places. One day, we decided to try and sneak into a small, seemingly vacant church about 2 blocks from my house. It had been maintained just fine, but was obviously not in use. I had never seen anyone come or go, and there were never any cars in its driveway. So here we are, 2 little girls, I think we were probably 9, playing secret spy agent or whatever one afternoon and sneaking around the back of this empty church. There was a narrow space between the back door, which of course was locked, and the high cement wall lining the edge of the property. In the mud, there was a set of fresh big footprints leading to an overgrowth of weeds in the back corner. Dumped there, and it seems the collection was accumulating over time as some items were obviously exposed to the elements longer and half buried, were the contents of dozens of purses clearly belonging to junior high-aged girls. The school ID cards of several girls were among lip glosses and tampons and little jelly bracelets and stuff. Super creepy. We left immediately and were too ashamed to ever tell an adult. I sometimes wonder what the hell that was and hope my silence didn't contribute to suffering. I once explored a burnt-down house. It was okay because it was during the day, but when I stood at the top of the staircase going into the basement, it was pitch black and a bit unsettling. I think to myself, it's just a house. Someone lived here. It's not so bad. And I turn on my phone's flashlight. I start down the stairs and I almost thought one was going to give out, but I continued. As I round the corner, there is a creepy fucking doll, maybe a foot tall, sitting in the corner staring directly into my soul. Ran up the stairs 3 at a time, broke one of the stairs and didn't look back. Dolls are creepy in the dark. Me and 2 friends at about 13 years old were walking down a mile-long abandoned train tunnel, kind of like a rite of passage in the village I grew up in. No torches, nothing. Being responsible, we told an adult, a local roofer we passed on the way down to the tunnel and knew from the village, where we were going in case of injury, etc. He said, "Don't go down there, it haunted," called bullshit, "We're not scared," etc. Got halfway down the tunnel and heard a revving noise really loud. I thought it was a quad bike or something, but I turned round and saw perfectly silhouetted at half a mile a man with a fucking chainsaw. Now, I don't know if you have ever run like your life depended on it, but Usain Bolt could not have beaten me over the last half mile. My father owed a pub at the time we ran back into the pub, scared shitless broad daylight. Told him what happened. He didn't seem shocked enough to be honest, just sort of nodded sagely. Turns out the roofer followed us down there and decided to fuck with us and had gotten back to the pub first and told my dad, who fell about laughing. Abandoned mental health facility, Sunnyland. Walked in one night with a friend and found Polaroids of patients on a corkboard, as well as file cabinets with patient files in it. Found what appeared to be a small rec area approximately 20 by 20 feet with grass 4 feet high. As we were looking around, we both heard one of the metal frame beds slide on the tile floor back inside. We both looked at each other and proceeded to see who could get out the quickest. Laughed so hard once we were out and back with our girlfriends. Who wouldn't come in? Looked at each other, eyes wide. Was one of the scariest moments of my childhood. Good times. My friends went all the time and still do, and I only went along once. We didn't discover anything tangible that was creepy when we went, but they often tell a story about a certain stretch of woods off a long road in central California. Apparently there was some large farm that was abandoned there, and the people who lived around there said they saw lights on in the farmhouse all the time. I assumed it was other explorers, despite it being completely empty and overrun with plant life. 2 of my friends went there together during the day to investigate and said that there was nothing immediately abnormal about it. But after staying there for about 20 minutes, they started to hallucinate, auditory and visual, and completely passed out for about an hour on their way back. They say they have no idea what it was, but I suspect some sort of gas leak or something. Don't do it anymore. One time I went into an abandoned Six Flags and I met a hobo who thought I was trying to graffiti in his house. He was not happy about that and he was pretty aggressive, so we decided to leave that area and climb to the top of the tallest roller coaster and smoked a joint. If he would have left us alone, he probably would have been invited to join our sesh. Another time I broke into an abandoned hospital and saw some junkie passed out with a needle in his arm. He might have been dead. I noped out of there quick. I went back a few months later and went to the same room where I found him, and there was no body there, so if he was dead, someone found and moved his body. Once went into an old abandoned factory well known for making chocolate in the UK. Went in armed with spray cans to do some painting, and we did. Great fun. Walked into a giant area covered in glass from the roof. Was cool as fuck. Stayed around for a few hours and painted. Walked around some more and got to the bottom of the main tower. Police tape everywhere, and blood. We just noped the fuck out of there and left. Terrifying. Edit. For all those wondering, was Terry's Chocolate Factory in York. Tape was at the bottom of the main clock. Once went into an old abandoned factory well known for making chocolate in the UK. Went in armed with spray cans to do some painting, and we did. Great fun. Walked into a giant area covered in glass from the roof. Was cool as fuck. Stayed around for a few hours and painted. Walked around some more and got to the bottom of the main tower. Police tape everywhere, and blood. We just noped the fuck out of there and left. Terrifying. Edit. For all those wondering, was Terry's Chocolate Factory in York. Tape was at the bottom of the main clock. Broke into this old wooden home that was on a hill in my hometown. We always heard stories about this house as children, and over one summer, we started breaking into places that were supposedly haunted. Walked in this house at night, flashlights, video camcorder, and prepared for the worst. Looks battered and old. Wood is starting to look. Everything seemed normal until we went downstairs. Blood stained everything, and the floor was littered with animal bones and skulls. Literally a sea of skulls from anything to a cow to horse to dog. Antichrist cross still hanging on the wall from whenever this was occupied. That's when we heard a thump and we all ran out of there with our dicks between our legs. A couple friends and I decided to explore an abandoned nursing home past polio hospital in the next town over the other day. And while in the basement, we came across a crawl space which led to a larger room that had a perfectly cut 5x5 square in the floor, about 10 feet in depth, filled to the brim with water. It was so perfectly still and clear that we questioned if it was glass at first glance. We couldn't figure out how the pool filled up with water because the room didn't have any openings or holes in the ceiling for possible rainfall, and the rest of the room didn't show any signs of flooding. What's creepier is that at the bottom of that pool, there was a cage, although we didn't see anything inside. Just outside my college town was an old abandoned house down a dirt road that people used to go hang out in to drink, look for ghosts. We'd drive out for the ladder and cut our engine, headlights so the neighbors wouldn't call the cops. They did that a lot. The whole place was falling apart. I'd have loved to have seen it back in the day. It was at least 2 stories and a cellar. I never went upstairs. The steps looked like they were going. And just a mess. We used to find jugs of weird shit, shoes with nailed-on bottoms, lots of evidence that the place had been abandoned for decades. The thing that made us nope the fuck out, however, was the shed outside the kitchen window. It was full of dead turkeys. At first we assumed some animal was dragging its regular meal in, but you could tell by looking that they'd had their heads smashed in and were pretty much untouched. Nothing was eating on them. They were just getting piled up to rot in there. You could see the older corpses underneath, piles of old feathers and bones. We came back a few times after we found it, and it was pretty much always the same. Still no explanation. When I was a kid, I was exploring a graveyard with some friends. One of the big box-like tombs had its side missing, as it had collapsed inside. We dared each other to climb in. When it was my turn, I was looking down at what seemed to be toe bones poking out of the deepest part of where the earth had collapsed. Then there was a creaking noise, and it all went dark. The rest of the stone box had chosen that moment to collapse, trapping me in an occupied grave. My friend managed to lift the big top slab enough for me to squeeze out. We ran, oh boy did we run. I think I spent the rest of the day gibbering under the duvet. The next day we went back to check that it had really happened, and he found that without the adrenaline, he couldn't lift the slab. A few years ago, while retracing some property lines, we came across a cemetery out in the middle of the woods. The graves were from 1850 to 1910, and a bunch of them had depressions in front of the tombstones, presumably where the caskets had collapsed and the earth caved in. The worst part was that there were apparently several unmarked graves that had also collapsed, and we had to map the locations of all of them. My only thought the whole time was what I would do if I fell into another of the unmarked graves that haven't fallen in yet. 3 friends and I broke into this very old abandoned 2-story house, supposedly haunted, at 3 a.m., and we opened an old closet. We found Playboy magazines, a bong, a vibrator, and a letter. The letter said, "Congratulations, whoever you are. You worked up the nerve to break into this haunted house." As you can see, it's not haunted, but this house has provided a fun mystery story for generations in Thea Town to break into. Everyone needs to experience some mystery and adrenaline in their lives. What we ask is that you leave a talisman of your being here. Please don't wreck the house. And when you leave, we ask that you shut the door all the way and tell others that you experienced an entity in the house. This carries on the mystery for future generations. Once again, thank you and congratulations. Edit. Yes, we left a blue lanyard from our high school and an unopened can of Red Bull and a Chevrolet symbol off of my friend's old pickup. Edit. The letter was not dated, but was very dusty and a bit brittle, and written in fine cursive. Not even sure if they teach cursive anymore in school. Could be a hint that it's pretty old. In Yonkers, New York, there was this abandoned house that a mafioso had left a body at. Me and my Haitian friend went there to explore. We were probably about 13. We gained entry into the house and we had our boombox with us as usual, but since we needed to climb in a window, we had left the stereo outside near the window. We walk around for about 15 long seconds when we hear from outside the window we came through the words, "I am cold. I am so cold." I don't even remember how we left the building, but we had to go back for the boombox. I always thought it was some kind of radio program that our stereo picked up, despite not being on. When I was 14 to 15, I was on a family trip in Switzerland. I am the youngest of 3 brothers, and we would always go exploring when on family vacations. We were staying at the base of a mountain, and one night my brothers and I decided to go walk around a little outside. We ended up stumbling upon this cave that had signs all around it saying, "Eingang verboten," entrance forbidden. Being 3 teenagers, we of course decided to check it out. We started walking into this cave, and about 20 to 30 feet deep, it became super dark and cold. We slowed down and decided we probably shouldn't go any further. Just as I was about to turn around, I felt something brush against my hand. I told my brothers to stop and that it wasn't funny, but they were far away enough that it couldn't have been them. I then reached out in front of me and felt this wet, furry thing. At this point, I started to panic, but I remembered I had a flashlight in my backpack, so I grabbed it. Turned the light on, and to my horror, I saw rows and rows of dead deer hanging upside down with their stomachs cut open. Worse, they were all still dripping blood, which I realized then was all over my hands. I guess some hunters had hung the deer up, and apparently this had happened pretty recently. Either way, we ran out of there like our lives depended on it and never told our parents. It was definitely one of the creepier things I've seen. I was 16, and my best friend and I were wandering through the abandoned asylum grounds right by my house. There was one tall tower that had been dark and locked up for as long as I could remember. This time, not so much. At the very top, there was a light on, and we heard a strange barking noise. At first, I'd thought it was coming from someone else walking their dog in the area, but nope, it was from the top of the tower. We hesitantly looked up, and there was a silhouette in the window. The barking was coming from a person. Without even thinking, we took off running. Behind us, the person called out in a sing-song voice, "Bye now." I stayed away from that place for a good few years after that. Basement under the college language lab turned out to be an abandoned secret society from the 1800s. The building had originally belonged to the society. It had about an inch of water on the floor in parts, long hallways and no lights. But the really weird part was the main room that had vaulted ceilings supported by pillars that had stone skulls as an architectural detail. Atop the skulls were metal spikes, presumably for mounting candles. At the front of the room was an altar with a backstage area behind it. There was a chair back there and a paper with some questions on it. Another room locked from the outside and had only a sofa in it. We brought friends back a second night. By the third attempt, someone was on to us and the entrance was padlocked. It was a long time ago, but they were somewhat leading and very specific. We thought they might have been questions for pledges / initiates. Almost as if the inductee had shared very personal information with one person and now was going to be put in a position to have to reveal it in front of the entire group. This was not one, but the questions were structured like this. What happened to you when you went on the bus trip to see your aunt when you were in 8th grade? Different, but a similar story from the person who said something creepy. So when I was younger, I was part of a youth organization of sorts. One volunteer thing we did was regularly mow and do maintenance on an old cemetery. No one had been buried there since the 80s, but once we took care of it, people started using it again. Keep in mind, this is in a really rural area, so we are mowing and doing other shit one day. I was in high school at this point. It was near the end of the day, so most people had gathered by the gates. I was in the far corner, crouched down in tall grass in part of the unused cemetery. I was going through an old pile of flowers, finding the years and years worth of plastic flowers that had been tossed away so they could be thrown away properly. A few young kids come over and start playing in the tall grass. They are making their way toward me, and I could tell they hadn't seen me yet. When they got close but still hadn't seen me, I said, "Stop walking on my grave." They instantly froze and looked around. Then they took off sprinting so fast. One kid even started crying. Once my mom found out what I did, she was pissed, but I still thought it was hilarious.
Thank you for watching. Hope you had a scare, and a happy Halloween.